Today's episode is sponsored by Rev, the productivity powerhouse for content creators, journalists, market researchers, and more. Capture audio from anywhere, get AI-powered summaries and quotes, and leave security worries behind with Rev. Whether you're on the go or in the office, Rev's got you covered. Discover more at rev.com. Hi, I'm Kendall Kelton, and I'm your host today on The Rough Draft. Featuring honest conversations with folks from across the creative industry, The Rough Draft explores the creative process, tools, and resources used by some of the best in the business. From journalists to content creators and business leaders, we shed light on what it looks like to break into the industry, make mistakes, collaborate with others, and the essential tools that help us all along the way. I'm really excited about this week's guest, Josh Olenslager. As the Director of Publishing Operations at LinkedIn Learning, Josh helps distribute video courses to professionals all over the globe to help them learn new skills at their own pace. With an MFA in poetry and a career that blends creativity with tech, he's written a book of poetry and is currently working on a second musical. We had an inspiring chat about how creativity and professional worlds intersect, and I can't wait to share it with you. Hi, Josh.
Hi, Kendall.
Hi. Thank you for coming on the show. You work for a company that I would assume almost every professional out there, at least in the US, knows and probably uses weekly, if not daily, LinkedIn. So I want to start things off by talking to you about what you actually do at LinkedIn.
Sure. I work in one of our businesses called LinkedIn Learning. And our one of our missions at LinkedIn Learning is to help professionals become more successful with their careers. So as part of that, we provide educational training in technology, business, and creative topic areas so that people can reskill. And in this age of AI, where everything is changing, reskilling is very important. So we take a lot of pride in the work that we do and the content that we publish to help people become more successful in their careers.
I want to dig into that, but first, how did you find yourself at LinkedIn?
I found myself at LinkedIn through various different acquisitions. I was in grad school in Wyoming working for a stock footage company.
Oh, wow.
At the age of the internet, the digital video internet, at the same time YouTube, as an example, was being built as a platform. I worked for a stock footage company where we had contracts with various producers and content owners such as NBC News, National Geographic, the NCAA, all their sports libraries. And they had warehouses full of VHS tapes and other like analog media from, decades of production. And they were trying desperately to figure out how they could get this content digitized and into clouds. So I worked for a company where we were building private clouds essentially for these content owners. And then we had figured out a system for digitizing all of the things that they had on VHS tapes and digibetas and DVDs.
Yeah.
And then we were cutting that up and remarketing part of that as stock footage. So that's kind of like how I got my technical start. And then I found a little company in Southern California called lynda.com. It was an educational training company, an e-learning company. And they were trying to grow in online video distribution and online video delivery. And so I was able to find a position there that worked well, and come in and help this small business build into this enterprise powerhouse that LinkedIn eventually purchased in 2015.
So how does LinkedIn Learning, how have y'all adopted to that pace, especially given like the workforce and how much information they're having to absorb and how fast you're expected to train?
Yeah, I think it's a delicate balance between one of our brand values is to create really high quality content compared with a Joe Schmo with a camera that's rambling on for a long time. And it's really hard to extract the value out of that content from a learning perspective. And so part of our value prop at LinkedIn and LinkedIn Learning is we create and curate the highest value content. So it's simpler on the discovery side, right? So people can consume it more easily. I think initially the first thing we had to tackle when I was at lynda.com is really about how do we scale that quality of content production? in a way that like we can maintain that value proposition of having high quality, easily accessible learning while we're continuing to grow that, so that we can build our coverage, right? So that we can have more people access more quality materials that are going to help them in their career journeys. And so like, over the course of the many years that I've worked there and through LinkedIn and everything, right, we've had to continually figure out how do we scale this quality component at the same time that we need the content to come out faster. It's literally like every week something will change within the training, and keeping on top of that is a very complex thing that we have to manage. As a result, that ended up having us try to figure out like how do we be more agile in our production methodologies, and how do we be more pointed and intelligent about our curation, so we understand like what do we need to update more urgently in order for people to be able to learn, to access that learning, and to stay on top of those things that they need to be successful.
So I kind of want to talk about are there any trends that you're seeing in the type of content or learning that people all over the world are trying to consume at the same time? Like, is it productivity in the workplace? Is it just trying to find a job? Like, are there certain topics that seem to be very prevalent right now?
LinkedIn is very focused on professionals in the workplace. And so, we try to figure out how do we engage people who aren't like you would think of as a traditional professional, right? Like, how do we engage people that are in the service marketplace as an example, so that they can find productivity content and maybe grow into a managerial role or something like that. And then we have the opposite side of the spectrum, right? Which is like, hey, I've got a CEO who needs to figure out, I don't know, how to prepare for a meeting with an unexpected like new client, or how to think about business as a narrative, as an example. The trends that we're really seeing right now is a high consumption on what is AI content, how is that AI going to impact my business, or how do I need to think about implementing that AI so it can impact my business, right?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I've heard a few people talking about this recently, where I think it's not that the fear of AI is necessarily gone, but it does seem like we're in more of the adoption and like, okay, that's not going to go away. How do we make it work? And it's kind of like history repeating itself in certain cycles. Like there was the internet at one point where everyone was like, whoa, what is this? And then it became a helpful tool and you adopted with it. And so I think we're at that stage, right? So are there things that your team in particular are doing with AI to kind of help nudge, where your audience needs to go at this stage?
Speaking on my behalf, not on LinkedIn's behalf, but the environment is incredibly wide open, right? And I think like if you can look at the investments across all of these different tech industries and the way people are thinking about how does AI, like trying to wrestle with that question, how is AI going to impact me personally? And also the business that I work for, and how do I prepare for that? Right. I think over time, just like we saw with everything else, we started in kind of this Wild West environment. And so, I think over time, like that's when we start to see the standardization, like there'll, obviously governments will start to regulate some of the things AI is able to do. We need to think about trust a lot in the AI world. And how do we make sure that we're building systems that people can trust, right? That they're they can understand, they can trust, and they can provide value, right? So we're kind of in this like nebulous territory of being able to try to work through all of these complex questions, whether they're ethical, whether they're legal, or whether they're just like value propositions, and are they going to be productive, right?
I'd love to actually talk about your team for a second. Mm-hmm. Your current role involves like leading and shaping large teams. So how do you keep things creative and exciting amongst like the chaos of the market?
Sure. So I don't think I actually said this earlier, but I lead all of the publication for LinkedIn Learning. So all of the courses that end up on LinkedIn Learning, my team handles those, and we do the packaging preparation so that we can distribute those. As part of that, it's a very technical function rather than a creative function in that way. But we work for a creative house, right? Like we work for a house where we have video directors and we have graphics artists and we have other people that are applying their creative energies in order to build this great product that we can distribute. The things that I'm doing to encourage my team on that creative front is like actually leaning into the human side of it, right? Leaning into the community around it so that we don't get caught up in this environment of, oh, the AI is going to take over some of the transactional pieces of my role, which allows me just to kind of like put my feet up on the desk. Actually, what that allows me to do is engage more fully with the creative community around me.
Yeah.
And being able to engage in that creative community at a deeper level, right, can generate new brainstorming, new ideas, new creative energies, and kind of get back to like that synergistic, the synergistic ideal that often we think about, you know, when we're saying like, you know, as a poet, I want to be part of a writing group, even though like some of the other folks in the writing group were, you know, we're at different levels and we have different ideas.
Well, I actually think that's a great transition for us. A lot of people juggle a corporate job with a personal endeavor, a creative endeavor. And so I'd like to talk a bit more about that because you have a creative side hustle. So how do you balance the two? And what advice would you give somebody who may have an itch to try something out outside of their corporate job, but just hasn't found a way to do so?
Sure. That's a really tricky, really tricky question. I can talk a little bit about like what I've done over the years and some of the things that have worked and some of the things that haven't worked. Ultimately, where I'm at today is about discipline and like being very regimented with my schedule. It's like the least exciting thing from a creative perspective to try to say like, I have a block of time and like, I'm going to try to force my creativity into that time. But I think like what I've done is I've changed my expectation about what I expect to get out of that block of time. Right. So like my time horizons have expanded in a way. So if I have, you know, a Saturday afternoon and I'm like, okay, I've got 3 hours on Saturday where I can sit down and work on like my creative side hustle, I actually don't expect that at the end of that 3 hours, I'll have made like significant progress. What I will have expected is at the end of that 3 hours, I've made some progress, right? Whether that's sparking new idea, whether that's like, I don't know, figuring out, I don't know, a word that's been stumping me or figuring out just like one small moment to move forward and then trusting that myself, one of those 3 hour blocks or one of those blocks that I've set aside, I'll have a burst, right? So like if you're an exerciser, you know about high intensity interval training, right? Where you burst and then you rest and then you burst and then you rest. But the thing is when you're resting, you're still working. And I think, you know, like if you think about creativity or side hustle or the way that I've been thinking about it is like really borrowing some of these concepts to say, if I sit down for a bit, I don't expect to have a finished product at the end of that bit. But what I expect is to have practiced. And through that practice over time, I'll end up becoming stronger when those bursts happen.
That is a great analogy. I find that such a great and helpful way to think about it. And my mind kind of went to, and I don't know if you would say it has or not, but has that mindset influenced how you approach projects in the corporate world?
Yeah, I mean, like it's a very similar, like when I describe the time horizon that I'm giving myself for a completion, right? I think like, it's like at the foundational level, there's no difference between a professional project and a creative project in the sense that like, there has to be a schedule and there has to be like a roadmap of, or a goal at the end of it and milestones that you reach along the way.
Yeah.
And so understanding like, you know, where you're at, whether it's in your career or your creative journey and being able to say like, what is the goal for this project that I have? Some of my projects, as an example, are simply practice projects. I'm like, my goal for this project is to practice. I need to write sentences and I haven't done that well. So I'm just going to practice writing sentences, right? Those sentences could be good or bad. That's irrelevant. You know, but like looking at the time horizon for what you have for your work or for your creative and saying, you know, do I have a deadline looming? Do I have something else where I need to like either increase the amount of time I'm spending in order to meet that deadline? Or extend that deadline out in order to give myself the practical space I need to accomplish all the goals or all the, like meet all the milestones along the way to achieving that project outcome. So, you know, I mean, it's in a lot of ways, it isn't the creative way just to say like, I'm the genius artist that sits down and I'm like, write something out on the first draft. Yeah,
splashing
exactly.
paint on the wall.
Yeah, I'm not Jackson Pollock, right? I mean, I might be have a wild mind like that, but I'm not Jackson Pollock, where I can sit down in an afternoon, smoke half a pack of cigarettes, and then like come out of it with a nice painting, right? Like that's just not the way that I can produce. And I think like being aware of that and being accepting of that, like as a professional or as a creative, that's going to help you go a long way.
We've talked to a lot of guests about their creative process. Like we just, you just very beautifully articulated to us your own, but we've also talked about kind of the evolution of tools. And so are there any tools that you think you have adopted recently that you think are very powerful? Or are there things that you're just like, no, I'm going to stick to, the bread and butter?
Yeah, I think at the foundational level, I'm still the bread and butter kind of guy. Like I still write in like my journal every day. Most of that writing is terrible, but what it does is allows me to like have that consistency over time, where I'm just like every day I spend some amount of time like putting pen to paper, literally, and like something comes out. And I really I'm not concerned about the quality of what's coming out, but like I'm concerned about the behavior that I'm building. And I think like, over time, you find those tools, whether that's pen and paper, whether that's, like typing up a text note on your computer or whatever, like you find those things where you feel comfortable and confident, and it's natural for you to practice in those environments and like kind of like build those habits and routines. I do think some of the new tools are exciting just from a curiosity perspective. I think one of the things about being creative is trying to figure out how do I continue to be curious and engage with the world, because it's so easy to get siloed, especially over the last few years. Like there was a forced siloing in a lot of ways, and like how do you reopen up that world, or how do you keep that world open? I think ChatGPT as an example is a really fun tool where like you can hold conversations, and like I try to stump it. Right. So
have you had any luck?
I know there's a lot of hallucinations and yeah. Actually, I've had a few where like, it's like, I don't know. I asked it the other day about whether a cruise ship qualified under the definition of an ark, because they're both really large ships, et cetera. And ChatGPT was very adamant that a cruise ship couldn't qualify as an ark. And it had a lot of like biblical like attribution and like references to saying, yes, you could fit a bunch of animals on it, but it's not so many cubits and it's not made out of wood and stuff like this. So like using these tools to kind of like explore for me some of the absurdities of the world and like ask in a lot of ways, like really, I don't know, obscure or obtuse or like ridiculous questions, and then kind of like see where that goes, like where that path takes it. And it in some ways can like replicate a little bit of like that brainstorming feedback that you would get out of a working group or something like that. But it's really figuring out, like on that front, how do you engage with those types of tools, whether that's ChatGPT or other types of tools, in a way that's going to drive that curiosity and like help split it open so that you can get in there and like, I don't know, have a little fun with it.
Well, now that we've covered a bit of your creative process, I want to hear more about your personal projects. You are working on a musical and a poetry collection. I would love for you to tell us more about those projects.
Yeah, sure. So every year I try to give myself something to work on, just to have, I don't know, to be able to, as I talked about earlier during the process stage, like block out those bits of time and have a project with a goal and some milestones to meet. This year, I decided I was going to work on my second musical. The first musical I wrote like 20 years ago, nearly. And so the second musical, it's been an idea that's been rattling around in the back of my head for 5 or 6 years. And of course, the second I sit down to write it, it changes completely, which is, I think, a pretty common refrain probably for people with creative side hustles. But what I ended up doing was like kind of breaking it down into the milestones of like, what am I really trying to accomplish? What is my goal? What am I trying to meet? And a lot of it was, I just want to pick back up and play piano again. As part of that, playing piano, like writing a musical gave me a format in order for me to like think creatively about musical composition. And it gave me a framework for being able to write music with a goal in mind, right? So it gave me a direction, which I think was very important. And I've had a lot of fun doing it. So, that's good. And then poetry, I'm always tinkering with poetry. And it's really interesting over the years how poetry changes format, subject matter and like its composition and its like all the technical pieces about it, like for me are constantly evolving.
Poetry is so interesting. Writing it is like, it's kind of bringing this like your inner kind of monologue to life. And it can be such a unique and also deeply personal form of writing. How does it challenge you as a writer?
Yeah. So I think a lot of it is, for me, poetry helps me understand my world. Like in a lot of ways, the world is very large and expansive, and it can be, I don't know, people talk a lot about, I can see the forest or I can see the tree, but I can't really see the forest and the tree at the same time. And I think like, even though that's a worn adage and a worn metaphor, like it's still true. And I think poetry for me helps me give me that perspective where I really want to see the forest. And so poetry gives me that chance to zoom out and look at like a world that's very abstract in a lot of ways and say, wow, this is a varied landscape with a lot of different pieces involved. And I want to understand that better. And so then I can zoom in on the details within the poetry.
And and it may or may not, but how has the poetry side of your kind of creative mind influenced the musical side? Or maybe it's vice versa.
I think they're related. In poetry, as an example, I think a lot about sound, and I think a lot about texture. More so than language even. So like word choice for me and all that, like even construction and like punctuation, a lot of that for me is about texture. And it's about the sound of things. So some of the poems that I've written in the past can be very abstract or nonsensical, and they're less narrative driven, I would say, and more like emotionally or like using sensation as a driving force. And I think like for me on the musical side, actually, it's way more narrative, right? Like, because you have to have an arc and a regular storyline, and you have to have character development and other types of things. But I still start from that. What is the texture and the quality of emotion that I want this particular piece of music or like this moment in this story to represent? And like, how do I evolve that sensation over the course of that project, right? Like how does that arc end up encompassing both that grandeur and that intimacy?
And would you be willing to share a bit about the musical itself?
There's an aging performer, an aging celebrity, and during the course of like her career twilight, she's feeling that age, right? She's coming in and saying like, I'm being displaced by younger people. Like the audience that I used to have and the attention I used to get from them and the accolades that I used to receive, like those are no longer consistent. And so like that absence is like a real thing for this character to be able to say like, I'm aging, I'm getting older. Obviously I'm in my midlife. So, I have midlife crises and other types of things that I'm dealing with. So like, it's a good feeder material.
I was about to say, this is a very human thing for so many people.
Yeah, exactly. Like we all go through these stages, right?
Yeah.
And the stage that I'm in, like this is driving sort of this narrative. And like, so the hero is like this woman who's sort of like in this crisis of change as she like approaches like middle age and like is moving towards the back half of her career and all this other stuff. And so all of that is like, as you mentioned, a very human thing that all of us go through, right? Like all of us go through these transitions. All of us have the need at some point in our lives to stand up for ourselves and say, this is who I am and this is who I am now. And it's changed. It may be different. Right. And to be able to like recarve out that moment of truth for themselves so that they can like find that balance and that hopefully for all of us, that moment of respite and joy, right? So that we can continue to look forward to living rather than running and being afraid of what we no longer have.
God, I mean, and that's, I would say even not just what you're creating on a personal front, but even professionally too, right? Like just there's a lot of synergies, I think, in what you were saying about adapting to, not just getting older, but just becoming, the further and further you get in your life or your career, and being able to adapt and stay confident and secure in your own right and being able to speak up to yourself. Like there's just seems to be a lot of synergies in what you're building creatively and then what you are actually trying to achieve with LinkedIn Learning, it feels like from the outside.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think I don't know, that's one of the realities of the world is as we live and grow and learn and we get more experiences, life seems to become more complex. And the sooner, for me at least, the sooner I embrace this idea of pursuing simplicity, right? It doesn't mean that it is simple. It just means pursuing simplicity. It's really helped me say, the simplicity helps me clarify my direction and clarify my goals, helps me overcome confusion that I may get lost in. And it really helps me it helps me build my own self-confidence, right? Because I'm clear on what I'm doing. And I think, that clarity can really open up the opportunity to pursue in a very passionate way, this idea of curiosity and opening and exploring the world.
How do you kind of see yourself creatively or professionally evolving?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've had so many projects that I've started and abandoned over the years. Realistically, the goal I'm stepping toward both creatively and professionally is being able to satisfy that itch for creativity, I don't know, in a more regular way or a more patterned way, so that it becomes more embedded in my life. As I continue to evolve, right, instead of starting a project and abandoning it, that's really where my current thing that we talked about earlier of being disciplined and making sure that I'm regimented about my practice, even if progress is small, that becomes so critical for me being able to achieve that goal that's maybe a few years out, right? My goal isn't what do I get done this Tuesday? My goal is, what do I get done this Tuesday that helps me be the person I want to be 5 years from Tuesday? And so, I think that's really where my mindset is at.
That was a beautiful way to wrap up this episode. I thank you so much for joining us. Before we go, can you let our audience know where they could connect with you?
You can always find me on LinkedIn. That's the easiest place to find me.
Well, thank you again.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity, Kendall. I really enjoyed it.
Well, that's it for today's episode of The Rough Draft. To learn more about our guest and to find links and resources related to the conversation, check out rev.com/podcast. If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to rate and subscribe in order to stay up to date with the latest episodes. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to seeing you again on the next episode of The Rough Draft.